Hello, and this is a book review. Some interesting ideas that I found in this book. Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. So in general, I'll probably give this book, I started like 3 to 4. I give it a high 3, which is like, this is like my system is there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 3 is divided to 2, so I have like a 6 kind of. So high 3 and a low 3. 3 is divided to 2, and that's a high 3 because it's almost a 4. It's almost a 4. I might even give it a 4 on Goodreads or something, but it doesn't deserve a whole 4 for the reason that there is many stories, quite long stories, which makes the book quite easy to read, but it's too long and somewhat annoying. In general, I dislike stories, especially when they're too long. If they're like a very short story, it's okay, but not too long stories. And especially it talks a lot about himself, and some of it is good stories. He's a very good storyteller, but it was too long, so high 3. Maybe even I'll go with a 3 eventually, and not a 4 in Goodreads, but I'll decide. And in general, it was a kind of interesting book. I did learn, and I wrote all what I learned in the notes. But I think it's interesting and to expose yourself to some things I was not exposed to before about elderly and about what's happening in those areas. So let's see the notes. Some people have trauma when seeing people dying. The author experienced dreams in which his patients were dead and he was not. It was the fault. So it was kind of like interesting that people do have those kind of nightmares or trauma when they care of people, especially when they're dying, and many times they take the blame. Dying from age was not prevalent back in the days. Usually people would die much sooner. I think it doesn't talk about it, but I think it's probably around the age of 30 was the average lifespan. So dying from age was not prevalent at all. The older you get, the more stiff your arteries becomes, which makes it harder for the heart to pump the blood. So the heart's kind of working harder and harder to pump the blood through a rigid, kind of more stiff arteries, which makes it harder to. So that's another reason for aging. Aging, just like complex systems, is a process that accumulates. There's a lot of redundancy in the system that allows damage to occur till everything breaks. So that's kind of aging. Complex system, there's like I said, there's a lot of not I said like I wrote, there's a lot of redundancy, but what happens is damage accumulates. So it's not one thing breaks, the whole thing breaks. A few things can break. It just accumulates and accumulates until everything just falls apart. Side note, the author argues for more customization for nursing residents. The problem is high costs that are associated with customization to people's wishes. So he's talking about how they need all that customization, which I totally agree, which they need more autonomy. And then I'm talking about the elderly, so they need more autonomy and they need more freedom, which currently they lack in many institutions. But my problem is that there is a high cost, and he doesn't really address this problem of high costs, which are a main problem. More customization costs more money and more liability, and he doesn't really offer a solution. I agree about the problem he raises, but there is no solution that he offers. Another side note, there is an interesting question. Where is the line in terms of allowing people to do what they want when disregarding bad consequences? So that's kind of an interesting question I thought about, is what do we do? Because in one hand, you want to allow the elderly to do what they want, but sometimes the things they want are dangerous. So what do you do in those cases? It's a little problematic, and so that's what I wrote here. Where is the line in terms of allowing people? It's similar to like should you wear seatbelt. You don't want to wear seatbelt, so you should have your freedom. On the other end, you will hurt yourself and you will pay for it. So same thing. Should people should, like, for example, older people be allowed to walk without help, or they should eat food that is dangerous for them? They want, and we want to allow them to have freedom, but on the other end, they might die. So it's a little problem. That again, it doesn't fully address. But it's kind of an interesting question. There's an interesting question. Why do older people narrow down? Is it a consequence of psychological or physical changes? This is not a question I raise. Here it is in the book. And the interesting question is, why do older people narrow down? Which usually they're like, narrow down means that they do less things. Is it a consequence of a psychological process or physical? So sometimes they can move less. So this is maybe what caused them to narrow down, because they can't do enough as they could before. But maybe it's like a psychological process. Assisted living sell themselves for today's kids, not to the residents. They show the kids, what do you want their parents to have? Doesn't really make sense, this sentence, but the idea is that assisted living residents, they sell themselves to the kids of the residents. They show the kids what they want their parents to have, and not what the residents really need. If they ask what the resident what they need, it'd probably be much different than what their kids want them to have. Since patients are like customers, oftentimes doctors do not want to let them down by saying how long you have to live and such. And many times doctors treat patients like customers. And oftentimes doctors do not want to let them down by telling them, for example, how long you have to live and all that stuff. So that what happens is that they don't want to let them down, so they just keep telling them, oh, you should take that surgery, you will be fine. That surgery would not affect you as bad, which in many cases this is not true. One of the ways doctors could speak with patient is being informative, which is to just tell all the details without demeaning. So he's giving like three options. So there is the informative doctor, which is just telling all the details, very, very dry, all the details, and many times he's not helping because he didn't really know what's going on. Other times I think it's a paternal doctor, which is like more like tells you what to do without the details. And what he says is the best one, didn't wrote it down here, but the best one is interpretive, which tells you the fact and tells you what it means for you. So this is like a kind of like all of it, which usually most doctors do not do, and he's saying that this is like one of the best ways. Side note, the main thing I learned from this book is that we should ask ourselves the question whether treatment worth it or not, and considering also the possibility of success. This is what the most things, there's a few things I learned from this book, but the main thing is that we should ask ourselves, do the treatment worth it or not? Many times we do not ask ourselves even that question. Do the process of healing, for example, worth it? How long is it going to take? And what's the consequences? How bad will I be after that treatment? Especially considering, that's what I wrote in the last part, especially considering the probability of success. Sometimes the probability is not that high, and we should consider the probability 10, 20, or even more, even 50, 60% success. This is not that high. And it might fail. What happens when it fails? How often it fails, and what's gonna be the results? So many times we don't ask those questions, and this is like kind of changed me in some way. So that's it for notes. And again, this book is gonna high 3. Again, interesting parts, kind of change my view on some things, my perspective. So I recommend reading that book. It's not a difficult reading, kind of easy. Lots of stories, which kind of like a little annoying. So I think it could be a little shorter, but it's an important book. That's it. Thank you.